Which are you more concerned about, the supply shocks or the demand shocks to come?
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be with you, Tom. I would say that the problem is that we have both the supply shock and the demand shock. At the very beginning, one could have said perhaps it is only a supply shock. We can do nothing as regards the central banks, of course, as regards the supply shock. And then let's wait for the coronavirus to be eliminated. And then we have a V-shaped recovery. Unfortunately, we see now, taking into account globalization, the supply chain at a global level, and all the consequences of the fear that is accompanying this epidemic or this pandemic, we see that there is a demand shock also. And we have both together at the global level. And this, of course, is something which calls for appropriate decisions, not only by central banks, of course, but by all partners without exception. And if I may, Tom, I am a little bit annoyed that we hear a lot from the G7, from the industrialized country. I heard nothing from the G20. And we have clearly a global issue, a global problems, with a lot of emerging countries being at the heart of the problem, including, of course, China. So it seems to me that it has to be taken up at the global level, and not only at the level of the G7.
President Trichet, I'm going to rip up the script here, and I do this with great respect for Chairman Powell and Christine Lagarde. With your criticism of a need for a global action, should we have seen a coordinated response with Chairman Powell the other day? Did they miss a moment by not linking together their actions?
Well, you know that I have experienced myself a coordinated action with a 50 basis point diminishing on October 2008, after Lehman Brothers. I have to say at the time, the drama was unfolding in a much worse manner, if I may. So the idea that we had absolute necessity to coordinate action at the level of the major central banks was something very natural. I'm not sure that it was really more appropriate in this time. It could have also had an impact of panicking, if I may, or giving the message of too much of a panic. So I think it's okay. What has been done is okay. I don't regret the coordination action.
Jean-Claude Trichet, one of the arguments that you could put forward as to why there wasn't coordinated action is that other central bankers think that cutting rates is a mistake. Could that be the case?
Well, again, each central bank has its own responsibility in its own law and legislation or treaty. So I think that there is no general rule to apply to everybody. That's one of the problems of, I would say, governance in Europe as well as in the world. It is that the recommendations are not the same for all. At this stage, I would say the main problem, it seems to me, is really to make liquidity available to all, credit available to all, and the amount, I would say, the supply of liquidity, supply of credit, is more important than the price that the interest rate themselves. But that depends, of course, on the various economies and countries concerned. In Europe, as you know, we have introduced the idea of giving liquidity, giving supply of liquidity without any limit. And that is still the case. It was introduced at the moment of the Lehman Brothers crisis, but it is still the case. But of course, availability of credit remains something which is and will be much more important in the present period.
Do you think, therefore, the ECB would be better to do more TLTROs to try and find some way of getting credit into the supply chains? Andrew Bailey was just talking about that, rather than cutting rates. Do you think that the more TLTROs, more kind of liquidity injections into the banking sector, that would be a better way to go for the ECB rather than cutting another 10 bips off the depot rate?
I have no recommendation to make to the ECB. The Governing Council has taken extremely wise decision since the crisis. So I have full confidence on the fact that they will do what is appropriate in the case. But it's clear that availability of credit will be something absolutely essential all over the euro area, whatever the level of interest rate is.
One of the great debates, Mr. Trichet, that we're seeing right now is the idea of disinflation or following on a greater inflation. Which way will price change cut? Do you anticipate dampened economic growth in disinflation, or can you worry about an inflation from another time and place?
Well, it is the complexity of the situation which is illustrated by the fact that the supply shock itself could transmit some kind of inflationary pressure. At the same time, the demand shock, which is the consequence of coronavirus, has exactly the opposite consequence. So we will see exactly where we stand. It's a very complicated story, but it's clear that the supply shock element has an inflationary potential.